Too much dopamine is bad for you. You can't have that much fun. You're getting dumb. You need abstinence to open your third eye. You'll be rich, successful, healthy, attract the attention of the opposite sex. That's what the proponents of dopamine starvation shout. Is it true? Dopamine is a media favorite in any conversation about pleasure and addiction. It's been equated with drugs, cited as the cause of lack of self-control, obesity, shopaholism, and it's almost the biggest enemy of the body and the cause of all your failures, lack of achievement, learning problems. If only it were that simple. But our body is a much more complex system. What is dopamine? Dopamine is often referred to as the hormone of joy and pleasure. We get dopamine as a reward from pleasurable things, from an adorable puppy to cocaine. Dopamine can even be triggered by aesthetics, like listening to a beautiful song. But dopamine is also released in times of stress, shock or pain. It helps you not to die from pain or fear. You also get dopamine when the person you envy has an accident, misfortune, and it's released when you refuse to do things you don't like. The most interesting thing is that the release of dopamine has been recorded in soccer players that misses apparently in this case. Dopamine tells us how close we are to the goal and prevents us from giving up. So it's not exactly like the happy hormone. Let's say you taught someone to press a button 10 times to get a small ball of ice cream. Their dopamine would go up, and then if they pressed the button 10 more times and got a double scoop of ice cream, their dopamine would go even higher. Unfortunately, if that person gets a small ball of ice cream again, their dopamine level will actually drop. If dopamine were really a pleasure hormone, it would encode the objective value of the reward, meaning that each time the same size ice cream ball was given the same amount of dopamine, but instead it turns out that dopamine encodes a failure to meet your expectation. If the reward system had been created by an engineer, our desires would decrease with increased consumption. But our human tragedy is precisely that the more we are given, the more we desire. Why do we supposedly need dopamine starvation? Proponents of the dopamine starvation theory base their theory on the addictive mechanism of dopamine. That is, when you get large amounts of dopamine, the receptors become desensitized. So you supposedly have to give up gadgets, the internet, delicious food, music, and then you can enjoy monotonous work, learning new information, want to exercise. Will it really work? Not really, because after 24 hours you will open your shorts feed again and start watching videos again. You can force yourself not to reopen social media with self-discipline, but is there a need for such a long, complicated asceticism? Or could it be sped up by 12 hours with your eyes closed, or even faster, if you completely deprive yourself of sound? The concept of dopamine starvation was coined by psychologist Cameron Seppa with a very different meaning. He simply chose the term poorly and it was immediately leaked to the media. Later, this psychologist wrote a new complete guide to dopamine starvation 2.0, where he explained that only impulse use of social media should be reduced when it's not necessary, to avoid only those pleasures that harm us. Reduce not by giving up, but by replacing it with an activity that's more useful to you. For example, it would not be helpful for an SMM professional to give up social media in favor of meditation, especially if they don't like it. So we just need to change the activity to another, more useful activity that you like. If you don't feel like doing anything, sit on the couch for 10 minutes without a gadget. Without a gadget, you will immediately want to do something: cleaning, reading, self-development. If you lock yourself in a room with no smartphone but a book, you'll start reading unless you find something more interesting. If your internet goes down, you're more likely to turn on the TV that's been dusty for a long time. You just need to put off, at least for a while, those activities that you think are harmful and replace them with more useful ones. Neuroscientist Dr. Sapolsky argues that trying to reduce dopamine is an oversimplification of the nervous system. Reducing dopamine, especially through starvation, is impossible. According to research on monkeys, dopamine is produced not only for treats, but also for waiting for them. And it works even better when the prospect of receiving it is distant. That is why we can work on a project for years with the prospect of getting a big reward in several years, and sometimes even after our lifetime. It turns out that when we refuse to watch videos on social networks, refuse delicious food, entertainment, and so on, dopamine also continues to be released, because we know that we will get our treats again in the future. And that's a good thing, because we wouldn't really want dopamine to decline, as it's critical for stress response, eating behavior, and movement. Additionally, studies have shown that there is a link between low amounts of dopamine and mental disorders, as well as Parkinson's disease. The most interesting thing is that when the probability of an outcome is 50% or the probability of success is uncertain at all, more dopamine is released. It is for this reason that some people are very addicted to gambling and lotteries. Evolutionarily, dopamine was necessary for our body's learning and survival processes. Higher calorie foods caused more dopamine release so that people prioritized those foods. Dopamine was released during sexual intercourse for procreation or social interaction. Simply put, you do something, you expect a certain result, you get it, dopamine is released, you keep repeating the action. If you don't get what you expected, no dopamine is released. Dopamine helps us to know if it's worth spending our time on an activity. What research exists on the relationship between social media and dopamine? In 2014, researchers performed functional magnetic resonance imaging on 20 participants, a very small number. They found that active social media users had more activity in certain areas of the brain that are also associated with other addictions. Again, not all areas commonly associated with addiction were active, and fMRI doesn't have a reputation for being a very accurate method. The best study to date of the link between social media and dopamine used positron emission tomography on 37 volunteers. The study found that a higher proportion of social media interactions correlated with a lower ability to produce dopamine. But correlation and causation are not the same thing. The authors of the study believe that people with less dopamine are more likely to be on social media, not the other way around. But even if that were true, it would mean that people already have too little dopamine. So we need to increase it, not decrease it. You can give the example of drugs, because they stimulate the production of dopamine in large quantities and the cells stop releasing it. But in the case of drugs, dopamine is released in incredibly large quantities. The dopamine reward system is broken, a significant part of the receptors are destroyed. People literally get into another dimension and experience strong sensations, if anything. This is not an advertisement, because immediately after the termination of action people become unbearably bad and painful. It's very unlikely that you can get that much dopamine from watching clips of new Marvel movie projects or memes. Also, some types of drugs block dopamine reuptake. This is when some of the dopamine released by the cell goes back into the cell and it becomes too much, which can't happen from a YouTube feed either. Is there any harm from dopamine starvation? Not at all. But people can always make up problems for themselves out of thin air. Imagine you're sitting there flipping through the shorts feed. And then, after an incredibly cute video with kittens, a man in a white coat, as it turns out later, not even a doctor's coat, but a chef's coat, appears and tells you how you are wasting your life watching the tape. And instead it is incredibly important to do yoga, meditate, buy 100 courses and be sure to pass all of them, while at the same time transferring all of the grandmothers across the street and starting a business. You drop everything, start doing things you are not interested in, but in the phone a person, or a doctor or a pastry chef said that it is all very important and necessary for everyone. Otherwise the brain malfunctions and in a few years you will turn back into a monkey. You do not get anything, because you decided to look at another video from this author, and now you still urgently need to learn programming and learn 3 languages, one of which is necessarily ancient. And what happens? You start to blame yourself, hate yourself, your mood is always bad, you become more nervous and frustration happens. What other interesting studies about dopamine have been done? There is one heartwarming study. In one of them, 2 people played an economic game, the rules of which suggested a 2-way way to get a reward. One was to win if the players could cooperate, in which case the sum of the winnings for both was the same, but rather modest. It was also possible to take the lead by betraying the opponent, in which case one's own winnings would be substantially greater and the other player would receive nothing. In both cases, dopaminergic neurons were activated, but activation was higher in the case of cooperation. Another excellent study examined the phenomenon of overpayment at auctions, when people give more than they originally intended. It turned out that people get an extra dose of dopamine when they beat their competitors at bidding, despite the fact that the amount is much higher than the real value of the item. The workings of the dopamine system were learned very well by psychologists who studied the Las Vegas phenomenon. As mentioned earlier, when we wait for our reward, dopamine is released. When the probability of winning is 50%, the dopamine portion is even greater. But in casinos, this figure is much less, and in theory people should not like to spend time there. But the creators of such institutions create the illusion of a high probability of winning. From everywhere there is information that today is your lucky day. The one-armed bandit has already lined up 2 of the 3 pictures in one line, and there is just a little bit left to a huge win. The third picture did not coincide, but you are like a soccer player that got dopamine from a misfeel that you are already somewhere near a huge pile of money. You must be sure to try again. All this is reinforced by free alcohol, which adds brain-pleasing substances to your cocktail of euphoria. What's the bottom line? There is no evidence that social media use has any particular effect on dopamine levels, and neither dopamine addiction nor dopamine starvation has scientific proof. Dopamine is released just as it is from other activities. If you feel you spend too much time on social media, try to replace it with something more useful that you enjoy. Then your brain will remember that the new activities have produced dopamine in response, and the next time you feel sad, you'll want to engage in that more rewarding activity. If you can't do anything about it, seek professional help.